I don't think now is the right time for another referendum.
I'd be worried about the uncertainty of a referendum.
What we really want is a debate to move on from this.
We need to be making the arguments in favour of the union because now is the time.
After 2014, pro-union groups may have thought the issue of Scottish independence had been put to bed, at least for a while. Well, think again. Thanks to Brexit, the pandemic, and a strong set of Scottish election results for the SNP, talk of INDYREF2 is slowly but surely growing again in Scotland. Like the SNP, supporters of the union must now carefully consider their next move. If you ask pro-union groups about holding INDYREF2 anytime soon, you'll get a definitive answer back.
I don't think now is the right time for another referendum. We are still in a pandemic. Thankfully, hopefully we're coming to the end of that sort of lockdown around the pandemic, but the economic recovery is going to take quite some time, and I think the idea of reopening the debate from 2014 and all the disruption that will entail during a serious economic recovery plan is just reckless, and I think most people are quite dismissive of the idea when they hear SNP politicians arguing for an immediate referendum. As long as the SNP are in office in Edinburgh and using all the levers of the Scottish Government to promote their independence agenda, independence and referendums are, sadly, from my perspective, going to continue to be on the political agenda in Scotland and indeed across the whole of the United Kingdom. I think that's of great regret. I think the Scottish Government should be absolutely focusing on our education system, our NHS, and particularly the economic recovery plan post-COVID, and that's clearly not happening when you have a First Minister and a political movement, which is what the SNP is, completely obsessed with one thing, and that is breaking up the United Kingdom.
There's a reason why now might not be the right time for union supporters to fight another referendum. Back in 2014, Scotland rejected independence with a healthy 55.3% of the vote.
The only answer for Scotland's sake and for Scotland's future is vote no.
Since then, the polling has slowly but surely narrowed, at times tipping in favour for the yes side. There is simply no telling at this stage who would win a second time around.
What's really interesting is how much we don't know. So we know quite a lot about the Scottish voter. We don't know a lot about what will happen over the next 5 to 10 years, economically, politically. So I think if I were putting myself in the position of the UK government, I'd be worried about the uncertainty of a referendum, the uncertainty that, given how close the polling is at this moment, could you take that risk? Are you willing to take that risk? The UK government seems quite comfortable. Boris Johnson himself seems quite comfortable with risk. So perhaps there's an argument in favour, but definitely it's a very uncertain situation.
There are a number of reasons why union supporters may be reluctant to fight INDYREF2. At this moment in time, the public don't want another referendum. The SNP aren't pushing for one imminently, so the timing isn't right. 2. As previously highlighted, the polls have narrowed. Unionists can't be sure they would win a second time around. 3. No UK government ever wants to be the one that loses Scotland, and it is in their power to accept or reject SNP calls for INDYREF2. Finally, the SNP under Nicola Sturgeon are highly unlikely to go down the radical route of holding an illegal referendum, like Catalonia did in 2017. Ultimately, why would unionists want to take such a big risk when they simply don't need to? Even if INDYREF2 isn't on the horizon, pro-union groups can ill afford to rest on their laurels. The conversation isn't going to magically go away. Making the case for Scotland staying in the UK is imperative for union supporters.
I think the economic arguments are inextricably linked to the emotional, moral arguments around who we consider us to be and how we share resources. But to answer your question, at its very simplest, and it's the Gordon Brown sort of expression, but it's a good expression, pooling and sharing of resources. That works. it makes sense to split the bill UK-wide. I think that conversation can move on, and I think it is not inevitable that the end point of this conversation is we're going to end up having another referendum on Scottish independence. I think it is possible for that to change, and it is far from inevitable. But it's only not inevitable if people like these islands, but also the political parties who favour keeping the union together, make their arguments.
Scotland in Union is one of the most active pro-union campaign groups running. Their chief executive, Pamela Nash, says the conversation needs to move on from independence in Scotland.
What we really want is a debate to move on from this. I was a Labour MP, I'm still involved in politics. I didn't get into politics to talk about the Constitution, and nobody did other than those who are in the SNP. What we want to do is get beyond that, and still seeing politicians at a UK level, they're trying to think of ways to make the argument for the union. I would say the best way for them to do it is just to show how it works and just to make it work, make it work for Scots and people throughout the United Kingdom. Rather than continually talking about Scots as a separate entity. Actually, we are part of the United Kingdom, and that needs to be reflected in what we see on our news every night.
The reluctance of pro-union groups to give in to INDYREF2 is justified. The majority of the Scottish public don't really want it, and it is not in union supporters' best interests to hold a referendum. Nonetheless, making the case for why Scotland is better off in the UK is an ongoing process, perhaps a never-ending one. Ignoring the debate entirely would be an unwise move.
Now is the time that more than ever we need to be making the arguments in favour of the union, because now is the time that there's a gap in the debate. And so we need to be on the front foot. And that means kind of girding our loins and making these arguments again, but hopefully being able to make them not in a defensive way in response to nationalists, but in a positive way on the front foot of saying, here's why the United Kingdom as a coherent whole works and is worth defending.